Between 1867 and 1940, the United States tranced Civil War nation into
ancient voices weave their spell, whispers of hills that...
In 1867, the United States was a nation still recovering from a devastating civil war. Cities lay in ashes, families mourned their losses, and the government struggled to reunite a fractured country. America was exhausted financially, politically, and emotionally. Yet in the middle of this uncertainty, one man dared to look far beyond the continent's borders. William H. Seward, the U.S. Secretary of State, envisioned an America whose future did not end at the Pacific shoreline. While most Americans focused on rebuilding, Seward looked toward the frozen, mysterious northern lands owned by the Russian Empire, a land called Alaska. The year was 1867. 2 years had passed since Union victory. President Andrew Johnson faced fierce political opposition, and the nation was uncertain about its future. Few expected the United States to expand, explore, or take bold diplomatic steps. But Seward believed that America's destiny extended outward. He imagined the United States standing among the great world powers, not just as a continental republic, but as a nation with influence stretching across oceans. When Russia quietly signaled it was interested in selling Alaska, Seward saw an opportunity no one else had the courage to take. For more than a century, Alaska had been a Russian colonial possession. Russian traders and missionaries built small coastal settlements. But by the mid-1800s, the territory was becoming a burden. The Crimean War had drained Russia's finances. Defending such a remote land was costly. Britain dominated the seas, and Russian leaders feared that in the event of war, the British could simply seize Alaska without compensation. To Russia, the land was becoming a liability. To the United States, it appeared as a vast, unknown frontier that only needed a visionary to recognize its potential. Seward was that visionary. He believed Alaska offered long-term advantages, a foothold in the Arctic, a potential gateway to Asia, untapped natural resources, and a way to outmaneuver British power in the Pacific. He saw the land not as frozen wasteland, but as strategic opportunity. Yet he knew he would face enormous resistance. Many Americans mocked the idea of buying a faraway territory of snow, ice, and polar bears. The country lacked funds after the Civil War, and critics saw no reason to spend millions on land no one understood. Still, Seward pressed forward. He believed the nation would one day thank him. On the night of March 29, 1867, something extraordinary happened. The Russian ambassador, Edward de Stokel, arrived at Seward's home. The two men sat down in a quiet room lit by candles and negotiated deep into the night. Hours passed. By dawn, they had drafted a treaty. The United States would purchase Alaska for $7.2 million, about 2 cents per acre. At 4 a.m., the agreement was finalized. By morning, signatures were added. With one decision, America had just bought a landmass larger than many European countries combined. But the transaction was far from secure. The Senate still needed to approve the treaty, and public opinion was against Seward. When the news became public, ridicule swept across the nation. Newspapers mocked the purchase with biting jokes and sarcastic headlines. They called it Seward's Folly, Seward's Icebox, and even Andrew Johnson's Polar Bear Garden. Critics questioned why the United States would waste precious money on frozen land filled with icebergs and tundra. Farmers joked that crops would freeze before they grew. Politicians accused Seward of being irresponsible, arguing that the country needed to rebuild, not expand. But Seward remained confident. He trusted that time would reveal the true value of Alaska. On April 9, 1867, the Senate gathered to debate the treaty. Opponents attacked it from every angle, calling it unconstitutional, unnecessary, and foolish. But Seward worked tirelessly behind the scenes. He persuaded, negotiated, and convinced key senators that American power demanded bold decisions. After intense discussion, the vote was cast. The treaty passed, 37-2. Alaska was officially part of the United States. Later that year, on October 18th, the American flag was raised in Sitka. The purchase was complete, though acceptance among the public would take far longer. What many Americans did not yet realize was the extraordinary wealth hiding beneath Alaska's snow. The land was rich with forests, minerals, fish, and wildlife. It held copper, coal, and eventually would reveal some of the largest oil reserves in North America. It offered strategic military positioning and access to Arctic routes. Yet, in 1867, the territory remained isolated and largely ignored. For nearly 3 decades, Alaska felt like a forgotten northern frontier. Everything changed in 1896. Gold was discovered in the Klondike region, and suddenly the world rushed north. Tens of thousands of prospectors, adventurers, and dreamers poured into Alaska. The once mocked icebox became a land of fortune. The gold rush transformed Alaska's reputation overnight. Newspapers that once mocked Seward now praised his foresight. The massive influx of wealth proved that the $7.2 million investment had been one of the greatest bargains in American history. The gamble had paid off spectacularly. As the United States entered the 20th century, Alaska's importance expanded far beyond economics. Its location made it a strategic shield against threats from across the Pacific. It connected continents through air routes and served as a crucial military zone during both world wars. By the 1930s and 1940s, Alaska was recognized as a vital defensive frontier of the United States. The frozen North, once dismissed as useless wilderness, had become an essential part of the nation's security. Looking back, the purchase of Alaska stands as a symbol of vision, courage, and bold leadership. Seward saw what others could not. He imagined a future in which America extended into the Arctic and Pacific, opening new possibilities for trade, exploration, and strategy. Today, Alaska is a land of immense natural resources, vibrant indigenous cultures, and unmatched beauty. It remains a cornerstone of American geography, economy, and defense. The Alaskan Gamble was more than a real estate deal. It marked the beginning of a new era in which the United States began to look outward, beyond its continental borders. The decision to buy Alaska set the stage for America's rise as a Pacific and global power. What began as a gamble became one of the most important turning points in American history. It all started with a vision, a signature, and a frozen land that transformed into a national treasure. After the purchase of Alaska in 1867, something changed in the mindset of American leaders. The United States, once focused almost entirely on the continent, began lifting its eyes toward the ocean, specifically the vast blue expanse of the Pacific. For the first time, many in Washington understood that the Pacific was not a distant frontier. It was the future. It was a gateway to trade, power, and influence. A new dream was forming, the idea that America's destiny stretched far beyond the West Coast, across thousands of miles of ocean, into Asia and the islands scattered between. During the late 1800s, the world was experiencing a shift. Major European powers, Britain, France, Germany, were racing to colonize Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Steamships connected continents faster than ever. Global trade networks grew. Empires extended their power overseas as symbols of national greatness. While Europe expanded aggressively, the United States watched from afar, hesitant but increasingly curious. America had been a continental empire. Now it began to ask, should it become an ocean empire as well? The Pacific Ocean tempted American businessmen, missionaries, and naval strategists. For merchants, the Pacific meant access to the booming markets of China and Japan. For missionaries, it offered new peoples to convert and influence. For naval officers, it held islands that could serve as coaling stations and bases for steam-powered fleets. Together, these interests formed a powerful force pushing America westward once again, not across land, but across water. The transformation began subtly. American whaling ships ventured deeper into the Pacific, hunting along the coasts of Japan and the islands of Polynesia. Traders carried goods to Hawaii, Samoa, and Micronesia, building relationships and establishing small economic footholds. Missionaries began arriving in Pacific kingdoms, influencing local cultures, advising chiefs and monarchs, and slowly weaving American ideas into distant societies. These early movements were not official acts of government, yet they prepared the ground for a future American presence. As American influence grew informally, leaders in Washington realized that the nation needed a stronger navy to protect its interests abroad. The Pacific was wide and unpredictable. To project power across such a vast ocean, the United States needed modern warships and secure island bases. American naval thinkers studied the writings of Alfred Thayer Mahan, who argued that a great nation must dominate the seas. His ideas inspired politicians, officers, and even presidents. They began to see the Pacific not as an obstacle, but as a highway to global power. This shift in thinking marked a profound change. The United States, which had avoided overseas entanglements for most of its early history, began to embrace a more assertive role. National pride grew. Newspapers urged Americans to compete with European empires. Many felt that America's democratic ideals and economic ambitions required a broader stage. The phrase manifest destiny, once used to justify continental expansion, began taking on a new meaning in oceanic, global vision. At the same time, the Pacific itself was becoming increasingly valuable. The opening of Japan in the 1850s created massive new trade opportunities. Chinese ports were expanding. New shipping routes connected San Francisco to Asia. The discovery of precious metals in the American West fueled migration and investment, making California a major gateway to the Pacific world. The growth of railroads connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific meant that American goods and people could reach Asia faster than ever before. Geography and technology combined to draw America outward. Hawaii became a critical focal point of this growing Pacific dream. Though still an independent kingdom, it was deeply linked to American commerce. Sugar planters, shipping merchants, and missionaries formed powerful connections to the islands. American ships used Hawaii as a resupply point. Its central location made it ideal for future naval activity. Many in Washington began to believe that the United States needed to secure influence in Hawaii to guarantee its Pacific future. These ideas foreshadowed major events that would unfold in the years ahead. In addition to Hawaii, American interests extended toward the rest of the Pacific Island groups. Samoa became a location of diplomatic competition among Germany, Britain, and the United States. Each nation sought influence in the region for strategic and commercial reasons. The Pacific was no longer a peaceful, overlooked ocean. It had become a chessboard for global powers. America, though late to the game, intended to compete. As American ships sailed deeper into the Pacific, the United States entered a world of diplomacy, rivalry, and expanding ambition. But it was not only about strategy. Many Americans believed the Pacific represented a cultural mission. Missionaries wrote home about isolated island societies waiting to be educated, converted, or civilized according to Western beliefs. Politicians framed American expansion as a moral duty or responsibility to bring progress, Christianity, and modern ideas to distant peoples. This belief, though often self-serving, shaped the rhetoric surrounding expansion and gave it a moral justification that appealed to the American public. Meanwhile, trade opportunities multiplied. American goods such as textiles, machinery, weapons, and manufactured items found demand in Asian markets. Likewise, the United States imported tea, silk, spices, and exotic products from across the Pacific. The ocean became a busy highway of commerce, and American cities like San Francisco grew into bustling international ports. Businessmen and industrialists, recognizing the profits to be made, pressured the government to secure stable routes and protect American investments overseas. As the 1800s drew to a close, American newspapers and politicians began speaking openly about the nation's role in Asia. Some suggested that the United States should pursue alliances with Japan or China. Others argued for territorial acquisitions to ensure naval dominance. Debates intensified over whether America should continue its traditional isolationist stance or embrace imperial expansion like the great European empires. The national conversation grew louder, more urgent, and more ambitious. The push for Pacific expansion was also fueled by competition. The British Empire controlled vast territories across the Pacific. Germany sought islands to expand its influence. France held colonies throughout Oceania. Japan, modernizing rapidly after the Meiji Restoration, was emerging as a new Asian power. Surrounded by ambitious nations, the United States feared it might be left behind. The Pacific Dream was no longer simply an option. It was becoming a necessity for national security and economic survival. By the late 19th century, a new American identity was forming, one that saw the nation not just as a continental power, but as a rising force poised to shape the world beyond its shores. Politicians spoke of destiny. Strategists envisioned naval supremacy. Entrepreneurs dreamed of Asian markets. Missionaries imagined spiritual conquest. And quietly, steadily, American ships continued crossing the ocean, planting the seeds of influence that would soon grow into full-scale expansion. This was the moment when America realized that its future lay not only in the West, but beyond the horizon. The Pacific was no longer a distant boundary. It had become a stage on which America intended to play a central role. The dream of a Pacific empire had begun. carrying the United States toward a new chapter in its history, one that would transform the nation and reshape the map of the world. In the decades following the American Civil War, the Hawaiian Islands stood as a thriving Polynesian kingdom, ruled by its own monarchs and sustained by a unique culture stretching back more than 1,000 years. Isolated in the vast Pacific Ocean, Hawaii had long been a crossroads of explorers, traders, and whalers. But by the 1870s, a new force had begun shaping the island's future in expanding United States, with growing ambitions beyond the continent. What unfolded over the next 3 decades would transform Hawaii from an independent nation into a critical part of America's Pacific Empire. American influence in Hawaii began quietly. Missionaries arrived in the early 1800s, spreading Christianity and Western education. Over time, many of their descendants became influential landowners and business leaders. American merchants soon dominated the sugar trade, recognizing Hawaii's volcanic soil and warm climate as ideal for plantation farming. Sugar changed everything. It created immense wealth and linked Hawaii's economy directly to the United States. As American businessmen grew richer, they gained greater power over Hawaiian politics. By the 1870s, the Hawaiian kingdom, led by King Kaukua, sought to balance foreign influence while protecting native traditions. But reality was becoming more difficult to ignore. The United States was Hawaii's primary trading partner. Ships carrying Hawaiian sugar sailed almost exclusively to American ports. American businessmen lobbied for policies that benefited their plantations. Hawaii remained a sovereign nation, yet its economic survival was increasingly tied to the United States. In 1875, Hawaii and the United States signed a reciprocity treaty, granting duty-free access to Hawaiian sugar in American markets. The agreement boosted Hawaii's economy, but came with long-term consequences. It deepened American economic control over the islands and increased foreign investment. Plantations expanded. American landowners grew more powerful. And as wealth concentrated in the hands of outsiders, native Hawaiians faced rising inequality and diminishing influence in their own homeland. When the treaty was renewed in 1887, the United States demanded an additional concession: exclusive access to Pearl Harbor as a naval base. The strategic value of Hawaii was becoming increasingly clear to American military planners. The islands lay at the center of the Pacific Ocean, perfectly positioned for refueling and defense. Control of Hawaii meant control of the Central Pacific. The dream of an American ocean empire was becoming a reality, and Hawaii was essential to that vision. Meanwhile, political tensions escalated within the kingdom. In 1887, a group of American and European residents forced King Kalakaua to sign what became known as the Bayonet Constitution, named for the threat of violence used to impose it. The new constitution stripped the king of his authority, reduced the political power of native Hawaiians, and gave wealthy foreigners significant influence. Hawaii was still a kingdom, but its sovereignty was now eroding from within. After King Kalakaua's death in 1891, his sister, Queen Liliuokalani, ascended to the throne. She was determined to restore Hawaiian autonomy. She sought to draft a new constitution returning voting rights to native Hawaiians and strengthening the monarchy. Her efforts alarmed American businessmen, who feared losing political control and economic privileges. They believed the Queen's reforms threatened their future. The tension reached a breaking point in January 1893. A group of American and European residents, backed by the U.S. Minister to Hawaii and supported by U.S. Marines from the USS Boston, orchestrated a coup. They declared the monarchy overthrown and established a provisional government. Queen Liliuokalani, facing the presence of American military forces and hoping to avoid bloodshed, yielded her authority under protest, believing the United States government would later restore justice. She was mistaken. The provisional government immediately sought annexation to the United States. The overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom shocked many Americans. President Grover Cleveland condemned the coup, calling it an abuse of American power and a violation of Hawaiian sovereignty. He attempted to restore the Queen, but faced resistance from annexation supporters and powerful business interests. Ultimately, Cleveland's efforts failed. The provisional government continued to rule, later renaming itself the Republic of Hawaii. The monarchy was never restored. For native Hawaiians, the loss of their kingdom was heartbreaking. Their land, culture, and political authority had been eroded through decades of foreign interference. They petitioned, protested, and appealed to the United States, but their voices were ignored. The islands were now caught in the currents of global power politics. And these currents grew stronger as the 19th century came to a close. By the late 1890s, events far beyond Hawaii would determine its fate. The United States was becoming increasingly involved in overseas affairs. The rise of American naval power, the push for Pacific expansion, and the onset of the Spanish-American War all converged to make Hawaii more important than ever before. The U.S. Navy needed a strong, dependable base in the Central Pacific. Hawaii was the perfect choice. When war with Spain began in 1898, American ships rushed across the Pacific toward the Philippines. Many stopped in Honolulu to refuel. Hawaii's strategic value could no longer be denied. Annexation was now viewed as essential to national defense. In July 1898, the U.S. Congress passed the Newlands Resolution, formally annexing Hawaii. The islands became a U.S. territory, and Pearl Harbor grew into one of the most important naval bases in the world. For the United States, Hawaii's annexation marked a decisive moment in its emergence as a Pacific power. It provided a stepping stone toward Asia, strengthened America's naval reach, and anchored its presence in the heart of the Pacific Ocean. For Hawaii, however, it meant the end of independence. The overthrow of the monarchy and the loss of sovereignty left deep scars that continue to shape Hawaiian identity today. Native Hawaiians fought to preserve their culture and history, even as their islands became integrated into the expanding American empire. By the end of the 19th century, Hawaii had transformed from a proud, independent kingdom into a critical component of America's Pacific strategy. The island's journey from monarchy to U.S. territory was driven by economic pressures, political struggles, and the ambitions of a nation reaching across the ocean. Hawaii's story is both a tragedy of sovereignty lost and a turning point in the United States' rise to global power. By the late 19th century, the United States stood at a crossroads. The nation had expanded across the North American continent, secured Alaska, and established deep influence in Hawaii. Yet many Americans believed a new era was beginning, one in which the United States would move beyond its shores and become a global power. Wherever newspapers, politicians, and military strategists looked, they saw European empires carving up the world. Some feared America was being left behind. Others believed the country was destined to rise. It was in this atmosphere of ambition, anxiety, and opportunity that the conflict with Spain emerged. The spark of the war grew from decades of unrest in Cuba. For years, Cuban rebels had fought for independence from Spain. Their struggle was brutal, marked by famine, imprisonment, and reports of atrocities committed by Spanish forces. American newspapers eagerly printed these stories, often exaggerating them to shock readers and boost sales. Sensational headlines and emotional articles stirred sympathy across the United States. Many Americans began calling for intervention to help the Cuban people. Business interests worried about instability in the Caribbean. Politicians debated America's responsibilities. Pressure mounted on the government to act. Tensions suddenly exploded on February 15, 1898, when the U.S. battleship USS Maine mysteriously sank in Havana Harbor. The ship had been sent to protect American citizens during the Cuban conflict. When it blew apart, 266 sailors were killed. The cause of the explosion was unclear, but newspapers immediately blamed Spain. Bold headlines declared it an act of treachery. Public anger surged. "Remember the Maine" became a national rallying cry. Whether Spain was responsible or not hardly mattered. Americans demanded action. The pressure was overwhelming. In April 1898, the United States declared war on Spain. For the first time in its history, America was preparing to fight a major overseas conflict. Many believed the war would free Cuba from Spanish rule. Others saw it as the beginning of a new American role on the global stage. Whatever the motives, the United States was now thrust into a conflict that would reshape its destiny. The war unfolded quickly. In the Pacific, Commodore George Dewey led the U.S. Navy into Manila Bay in the Philippines. Early on the morning of May 1st, Dewey's fleet struck the Spanish squadron. The battle was swift and decisive. Within hours, the Spanish fleet was destroyed. Not a single American ship was lost. The victory stunned the world and announced the arrival of a new naval power. Suddenly, the United States found itself in control of a major Spanish colony on the other side of the globe. Meanwhile, the war in the Caribbean intensified. American troops landed in Cuba and faced challenging conditions, heat, disease, and unfamiliar terrain. Among the most famous units was the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry, known as the Rough Riders, led by Theodore Roosevelt before he became president. Alongside African-American regiments, known as the Buffalo Soldiers. They fought in the battles of Las Guasimas and San Juan Hill. Their charge up the hills outside Santiago became one of the iconic moments of the war, capturing the imagination of the American public. Spain, already weakened by years of conflict and colonial decline, struggled to defend its empire. In July 1898, the Spanish fleet attempted to escape from Santiago harbor, but was quickly overwhelmed by the U.S. Navy. This defeat effectively ended Spanish resistance in the Caribbean. By August, the war was over. It had lasted only 4 months. Yet its consequences would echo for generations. The Treaty of Paris, signed in December 1898, marked the end of Spain's once mighty global empire. The United States gained control of Puerto Rico and Guam. Cuba became a U.S.-occupied territory, though not formally annexed. Most dramatically, the United States acquired the Philippines for $20 million. These territorial gains shocked the world. America had stepped onto the stage of imperial powers. What had begun as a war for Cuban independence had ended with the United States possessing colonies thousands of miles away. The sudden expansion sparked fierce debate within the United States. Supporters argued that America had a duty to spread democracy, modernize distant lands, and compete with European empires. They saw victory as proof that the United States was destined for greatness. Critics disagreed sharply. They warned that ruling overseas territories contradicted the nation's founding ideals. Anti-imperialists, including famous voices like Mark Twain and Andrew Carnegie, argued that a republic built on liberty should not govern people without their consent. America was entering a moral and political struggle over its identity. For the people living in the former Spanish colonies, the war brought hope, uncertainty, and soon, new forms of struggle. Cubans celebrated the end of Spanish rule but quickly realized that American occupation limited their independence. Puerto Rico became a U.S. possession, beginning a relationship that would evolve over more than a century. Guam became a small but vital American outpost in the Pacific. And in the Philippines, hopes for independence were shattered when the United States decided to establish control, leading to a long and bloody conflict, the Philippine-American War. The Spanish-American War marked a turning point in American history. It demonstrated the power of the modern U.S. Navy, validated theories about sea power, and propelled the United States into global affairs. It also marked the beginning of a long American presence in the Pacific, reshaping the balance of power in the region. What had begun as a humanitarian concern for Cuba evolved into a broader imperial project. Beyond the battlefield, the war changed American culture. Newspapers realized their ability to sway public opinion. Politicians recognized the popularity of overseas victories. The American public, filled with patriotic pride, began seeing their nation as a rising global force. Theodore Roosevelt, whose actions in Cuba made him a national hero, would soon become president and further push America onto the world stage. In the aftermath of victory, the United States confronted a profound question. What should it do with the territories it now controlled? How should it balance its democratic ideals with its new imperial responsibilities? These debates shaped the next chapter of American expansion, influencing policies in Asia, the Pacific, and Latin America. The war had been brief, but it had opened doors that could not be closed. By the dawn of the 20th century, the United States was no longer a nation focused solely on its own continent. It possessed island territories, commanded powerful fleets, and held influence across oceans. The Spanish-American War had transformed America from a young republic into an emerging world power. It taught the nation that military might could reshape global politics and that the Pacific would be at the heart of its future ambitions. The War of 1898 was more than a conflict between two nations. It was the birth of a new American identity, one that would shape the decades to come. It marked the moment when the United States stepped beyond its borders and embraced a larger role on the world stage, setting the course for the empire that would soon stretch from the Caribbean to the far reaches of the Pacific. When the guns of the Spanish-American War fell silent in 1898, the United States found itself in possession of a collection of new territories scattered across the globe. Among them was a quiet island in the western Pacific, an island many Americans had never heard of, yet one destined to play a significant role in the nation's rise to global power. That island was Guam. At first glance, Guam seemed small, remote, and unimportant. But to military planners and naval strategists, its location made it an invaluable prize. Tucked between Hawaii and the Philippines, Guam stood like a stepping stone in the vast expanse of the Pacific, a place where ships could rest, refuel, and communicate across thousands of miles of ocean. Before the American flag flew over Guam, The island had been part of the Spanish Empire for more than 2 centuries. Spanish missionaries and settlers had introduced Christianity, built churches, and established new systems of governance. Yet despite these influences, Guam's native Chamorro people maintained a strong cultural identity rooted in centuries of tradition. Life on Guam moved at a slower, gentler rhythm than in the imperial capitals of the world. The island was peaceful, agricultural, and isolated from global conflict. But its isolation was about to end. During the Spanish-American War, the United States sought to weaken Spain by striking at its Pacific possessions. In June 1898, an American naval vessel, the USS Charleston, arrived at Guam, unaware that war had been declared. The Spanish garrison did not even return fire when warning shots were fired. Instead, they apologized for lacking ammunition and assumed the Americans were performing a ceremonial salute. When they learned the truth, the Spanish commander surrendered without a fight. In a matter of hours, Guam passed quietly into American hands. Few moments in history have altered the fate of a people so swiftly and so peacefully. After the Treaty of Paris formalized the transfer, the United States began its administration of Guam. Unlike Puerto Rico, which received a civilian government, Guam was placed under the control of the U.S. Navy. Naval officers became governors, judges, and administrators, combining military authority with civil power. For the Chamorro population, the shift in rule brought a mix of change and continuity. American governors introduced new laws, schools, and health programs. English became more common, though Chamorro traditions persisted. The Navy aimed to modernize the island, but it also maintained tight control over political expression and outside contact. In many ways, Guam became a world of its own, quiet, ordered, and governed from afar. The United States quickly recognized Guam's strategic value. At the dawn of the 20th century, communication across the Pacific was slow, unpredictable, and vulnerable. To solve this, the U.S. built a network of undersea telegraph cables connecting America to Asia. Guam became one of the most important relay stations in this system. Messages transmitted across thousands of miles passed through small buildings on Guam, turning the island into a communications hub. Though few Americans realized it, Guam was becoming essential to the flow of information across the Pacific. This communication network complemented another aspect of Guam's importance. Its harbor, one of the best natural harbors in the region, allowed American ships to anchor safely, refuel, and resupply. As the United States expanded its presence in the Philippines, Guam served as the halfway point between Hawaii and Manila. Steamships relied on coal, and in the age before aircraft carriers and long-range aircraft, islands like Guam were crucial for naval movement. In a war, controlling Guam meant controlling one of the Pacific's most vital crossroads. Despite its value, Guam rarely made headlines. It was a small, quiet outpost of American power. For the Chamorro people, life revolved around farming, fishing, and village life. Children attended American-style schools. Local leaders worked with naval administrators. Islanders adapted to new systems while preserving their culture. Though US rule limited political autonomy, it also brought new infrastructure, improved sanitation, and modern medicine. Yet beneath these changes, there remained a quiet tension. The people of Guam were governed by a distant power that did not grant them full citizenship or self-government. As the years passed, global tensions increased. Japan, rising rapidly after its victories in Asia, expanded its influence across the Pacific. American strategists watched carefully. They understood that Guam, though small, lay dangerously close to Japan's sphere of influence. The island's location made it both valuable and vulnerable. Naval planners debated fortifying Guam, but political hesitation and financial concerns slowed efforts. Compared to Hawaii and the Philippines, Guam remained lightly defended. It was a strategic outpost, but one without strong protection. By the 1930s, the Pacific had become a stage of rivalry between the United States and Japan. Military leaders understood Guam's importance, but diplomatic agreements restricted fortification of Pacific territories. As Japan expanded into Manchuria and eyed Southeast Asia, Guam remained exposed. The island had a small naval presence, limited weaponry, and no major defenses. Yet its significance grew with each passing year, as both nations prepared for the possibility of conflict. For the Chamorro people, the period under American naval rule brought both opportunities and challenges. Education improved, healthcare expanded, and new economic activities emerged. But political rights remained limited. Guam was part of the United States, yet remained outside the protections of full citizenship. Islanders lived under laws they did not create and were governed by leaders they did not elect. Still, many Chamorros developed loyalty to the United States, seeing American rule as preferable to other imperial powers, especially those expanding aggressively across Asia. By the late 1930s, Guam's fate was increasingly tied to the shifting balance of power in the Pacific. The island's quiet atmosphere belied the storm gathering beyond its shores. American strategists viewed Guam as a critical link in the defense of the Pacific, but they also feared it could become a target in future conflict. The island had become a symbol of both American presence and American vulnerability. It was a foothold in a vast ocean, a peaceful outpost caught between empires. As the world edged closer to World War II, Guam stood at a crossroads. Its importance was undeniable, yet its defenses were minimal. The island remained a place of calm waters, coconut groves, and village life, while beyond its horizon, powerful nations prepared for battle. Guam's quiet existence would not last forever. The next chapter of its story would test the resilience of its people and redefine its role in the American Pacific world. The acquisition of Guam was one of the quieter moments in American expansion, but its impact was profound. It connected the United States to Asia, expanded its naval network, and established a presence in the Western Pacific that endures to this day. Guam's peaceful surrender in 1898 marked the beginning of a complex relationship, one shaped by strategy, culture, and history. Though small in size, Guam became an essential piece in the puzzle of America's rise as a global power, a silent guardian in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. When the United States defeated Spain in 1898, the world expected the Spanish Empire to fade quietly into history, but few anticipated what would replace it. As the Treaty of Paris transferred the Philippines to American control, a new conflict began to take shape, one far more complex, bitter, and costly than the war against Spain. The Philippine-American War was a struggle born from clashing visions, one of a nation seeking independence after centuries of colonial rule, and another of a rising power convinced that it had a mission to govern and guide distant lands. It was a conflict that would test America's ideals, challenge its identity, and leave a lasting imprint on the people of the Philippines. For centuries, the Philippines had lived under Spanish colonial domination. But by the late 19th century, Filipinos were yearning for independence. In 1896, a revolutionary movement rose to challenge Spanish rule. Among its most prominent leaders was Emilio Aguinaldo, a young and determined figure who rallied troops, negotiated ceasefires, and inspired his countrymen with the dream of a free nation. When the United States declared war on Spain in 1898, Filipino revolutionaries believed the arrival of American forces might finally bring the independence they had long fought for. The early months seemed promising. Filipino fighters and American forces cooperated against the Spanish. Together they weakened Spain's control of Manila and pushed the colonial government to the brink of collapse. Aguinaldo declared Philippine independence on June 12, 1898, raising a new national flag and establishing a republican government. But even as Filipinos celebrated their hard-won freedom, political realities shifted. The United States, seeing strategic value in the islands, chose not to recognize Philippine independence. Instead, American negotiators in Paris arranged to purchase the Philippines from Spain for $20 million, despite the fact that Spain no longer controlled much of the country. To Filipinos, this was a betrayal. They had not fought to exchange one colonial master for another. As American troops occupied Manila, tensions rose. Filipino forces surrounded the city, demanding recognition of their government. American commanders refused, insisting that sovereignty now belonged to the United States. Both sides prepared for conflict, and mistrust deepened. In the night of February 4, 1899, a skirmish broke out between American and Filipino soldiers near a Manila suburb. Within hours, the clash escalated into full-scale war. A tragic and brutal conflict had begun. The Philippine-American War unfolded in two major phases. The first phase, from 1899 to 1900, resembled a conventional war. Aguinaldo's army fought in organized units, attempting to hold territory and confront American forces head-on. But the Americans had superior weapons, larger numbers, and more resources. Battles raged across Luzon, as Filipino forces tried to defend key towns and supply lines. Despite their determination, they were pushed back. After a series of defeats, Aguinaldo abandoned conventional warfare and shifted to a new strategy: guerrilla resistance. The second phase of the war was far more difficult, both militarily and morally. Filipino fighters melted into the countryside, using hidden-run tactics to strike American patrols, sabotage infrastructure, and disrupt communication lines. They received support from local communities, who provided food, shelter, and intelligence. American troops, unfamiliar with the terrain and frustrated by the elusive enemy, responded with harsh countermeasures. Villages were burned. Civilians were relocated into concentration zones. Curfews, searches, and interrogations became common. Disease and hunger spread through the population. The conflict grew increasingly bitter, and its human toll mounted. The island of Samoa witnessed one of the most infamous moments of the war. In 1901, Filipino fighters attacked American soldiers in the town of Balangiga, killing dozens. In retaliation, U.S. forces launched a brutal campaign across the island, destroying villages and targeting civilians. The event left deep scars and remains one of the most painful memories of the war. Across the archipelago, similar tragedies unfolded in remote towns and rural communities. The cost of the conflict was measured not only in battles, lost or won, but in the suffering of ordinary people caught between two armies. As the war dragged on, American public opinion grew divided. Supporters of the conflict argued that the United States had a duty to modernize the Philippines, bringing education, infrastructure, and democratic institutions. They claimed that Filipino resistance was misguided or manipulated by elites. Critics, however, condemned the war as an act of imperialism. The Anti-Imperialist League, featuring well-known figures like Mark Twain and Andrew Carnegie, denounced America's behavior as a betrayal of its own founding principles. They asked how a nation built on liberty could deny another people their independence. These debates revealed the moral complexity of America's new role as a global power. In the Philippines, the revolutionary spirit remained strong, but the struggle became increasingly difficult. On March 23, 1901, Aguinaldo was captured in a daring American operation. Facing overwhelming odds and hoping to spare his people further suffering, he eventually issued a proclamation urging Filipinos to accept American authority. Though resistance continued in some regions, the centralized fight for independence was effectively broken. In 1902, the United States declared the war over, though sporadic fighting and unrest persisted in parts of the Philippines for years. Even after the conflict ended, the legacy of the war shaped the relationship between the two nations for generations. The United States established a civilian government, expanded public education, built roads and infrastructure, and promoted English as a national language. Some of these reforms modernized the islands and prepared them for future self-governance. Yet the memory of the war of violence, the loss, the denial of early independence, remained deeply embedded in the Filipino national consciousness. Independence would not come until 1946, after another global conflict reshaped the world. For the United States, the Philippine-American War marked a turning point. It was the nation's first major colonial conflict, forcing Americans to confront the realities of governing distant peoples. It tested the country's ideals, challenged its moral authority, and revealed the contradictions between its democratic values and imperial ambitions. The war also solidified America's strategic position in Asia, giving it a foothold that influenced regional politics throughout the 20th century. By the early 1900s, the United States stood firmly as a Pacific power. From Hawaii to Guam to the Philippines, its influence stretched across vast ocean distances. But this expansion came at a high cost, one measured not only in dollars and battles, but in lives and in the complicated history shared between nations. The Philippine-American War was not a simple struggle between armies. It was a clash of visions, ambitions, and identities. It reshaped both countries and left a legacy that continues to echo across the Pacific. At the turn of the 20th century, as great powers maneuvered for influence across the Pacific, the United States found itself drawn into a small group of islands that would become one of its most enduring and unique territories, American Samoa. Unlike the conflicts that had brought Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines under U.S. control, the story of American Samoa unfolded through diplomacy rather than war, through negotiation rather than conquest. Yet the islands would go on to hold immense strategic importance, shaping America's presence in the South Pacific for more than a century. Long before foreign powers arrived, the Samoan archipelago was home to a proud Polynesian people whose culture, traditions, and social structures had developed over thousands of years. Samoan society was built on a system of chiefs, extended families, and communal land ownership. The people of the islands shared a deep connection to their land, their ancestors, and their way of life, known as Fa Samoa, the Samoan way. Life moved according to rhythms of the ocean, village gatherings, and ceremonial customs that defined identity and unity. This world began to change in the 19th century as European traders, missionaries, and naval powers entered the Pacific. By the late 1800s, Germany, Great Britain, and the United States were competing for influence in the Samoan Islands. Each sought strategic footholds, trading opportunities, and political alliances. Foreign factions supported different Samoan chiefs, turning local rivalries into international disputes. Tensions escalated, and the islands became the stage for diplomatic standoffs and even naval confrontations. Samoans found themselves caught between competing empires, each seeking to shape the future of the islands according to their own interests. In 1899, the great powers reached a decisive agreement. Germany would take control of the Western Islands, forming what would later become independent Samoa. Great Britain withdrew its claims in exchange for rights elsewhere in the Pacific. The United States assumed control of the Eastern Islands Tutuila and the Manua Group. This division split the Samoan archipelago in two, establishing a boundary that still exists today. On April 17, 1900, local chiefs of Tutuila signed the Deed of Cession, formally placing their islands under American protection. Manua followed in 1904. The people of American Samoa had not been conquered. They had entered into a relationship shaped by diplomacy and the shifting power dynamics of the era. Under American administration, the U.S. Navy established a presence in Pongo Pongo Harbor, one of the finest natural deepwater harbors in the Pacific. With its sheltered waters and strategic location, Pongo became a vital coaling and refueling station for American ships traversing the Pacific. The Navy governed the islands with a relatively light hand, respecting many local customs and maintaining the authority of traditional chiefs. Unlike other U.S. territories, American Samoa retained much of its indigenous social structure. The U.S. Navy recognized the importance of Fa Samoa and sought to preserve it rather than replace it. Life in American Samoa in the early 20th century blended local traditions with American influence. The Navy introduced modern medical care, improved sanitation, and established schools that taught both English and Samoan. Yet the daily life of villages continued to revolve around communal land, extended families, and the authority of mati, or chiefs. The islands remained rural, quiet, and deeply rooted in cultural heritage, even as they became part of a rising American presence in the Pacific. During World War I and World War II, American Samoa gained strategic significance once again. In World War II especially, the islands became a crucial staging area for U.S. operations in the South Pacific. Thousands of American service members were stationed there, building roads, fortifications, and airstrips. The islands played a key role in the defense of shipping lanes and in supporting operations against Japanese forces. The presence of American military troops brought rapid modernization and economic change, leaving lasting impacts on Samoan society. After the war, the question of political status emerged. Unlike Guam or Puerto Rico, American Samoa did not push for full incorporation into the United States. The people valued their cultural autonomy and traditional way of life. In 1951, administration of the territory shifted from the Navy to the Department of the Interior. Efforts to modernize the government system continued, but leaders remained cautious of changes that might threaten Samoan land ownership or cultural customs. Even as American Samoa grew more connected to the U.S., many islanders wished to maintain their identity and social structures. One of the most distinctive aspects of American Samoa is that, to this day, residents are considered U.S. nationals but not U.S. citizens at birth. They can live and work anywhere in the United States, serve in the U.S. military, and hold American passports. However, they cannot vote in federal elections unless they later obtain citizenship. This unusual status reflects the territory's unique history and ongoing effort to balance American governance with Samoan self. Through the second half of the 20th century, American Samoa experienced economic development, driven largely by tuna canneries, local industries, and government investment. Education expanded, healthcare improved, and infrastructure modernized. Yet everyday life still revolved around the village, the church, and the communal land system. The islands preserved a remarkable level of cultural continuity compared to many other territories affected by colonialism. The blending of modernity and tradition became a defining feature of American Samoa. American Samoans also built a strong reputation for military service. Proportionally, the territory has one of the highest rates of enlistment in the U.S. Armed Forces. Many island families have deep ties to the military, seeing service as both an honor and a pathway to opportunity. Despite their limited political rights on the national stage, American Samoans have contributed significantly to the U.S. military's missions around the world. As the 21st century progressed, the islands continued navigating challenges and opportunities. Storms, economic shifts, and debates over citizenship shaped political discussions. The relationship between American law and Samoan custom remained a delicate balance. Leaders and citizens worked to protect communal land, preserve Samoa, and ensure that modernization did not erase cultural heritage. At the same time, American Samoa maintained its strategic importance in the Pacific, serving as a key point of presence in a region increasingly shaped by competition between global powers. The story of American Samoa stands apart from many other chapters in American expansion. It is not a tale of conquest or annexation, but of negotiation and coexistence. The islands became part of the United States through diplomacy, and their people preserved a unique cultural identity under American administration. Today, American Samoa remains a place where modern American life and ancient Polynesian tradition live side by side, intertwined yet distinct. In the broader history of U.S. expansion, American Samoa represents more than a strategic harbor or a military outpost. It symbolizes the complex relationship between power and culture, sovereignty and partnership. It shows that empire can take many forms, and that the people who live within it shape its meaning as much as the nations that claim authority over it. Through changing eras, wars, and political debates, American Samoa has remained resilient, guided by the strength of its traditions and the enduring spirit of its people. At the dawn of the 20th century, the United States found itself standing at the threshold of a new era. The nation had expanded westward, crossed the Pacific, and gained territories stretching from Hawaii to the Philippines. But there remained one obstacle, one final piece of geography that limited America's reach between its two growing spheres of influence. That obstacle was the narrow strip of land in Central America known as Panama. It was here that the United States would attempt one of the most ambitious engineering projects in history. A project that would alter global trade, strengthen American power, and redefine the nation's role in the world. The Panama Canal became more than a waterway, it became a symbol of American ambition. Long before the United States took interest, explorers and empires recognized the strategic value of a canal across Central America. The idea dated back centuries. Spanish officials dreamed of connecting the oceans but lacked the technology. Later, the French made the first serious attempt under Ferdinand de Lesseps, the renowned builder of the Suez Canal. In the 1880s, French engineers began digging through Panama's tropical mountains and swampy jungles. But disease, financial scandals, and engineering failures doomed the effort. Malaria and yellow fever claimed thousands of lives. The French project collapsed, leaving behind abandoned equipment, unfinished ditches, and a legacy of tragedy. It seemed that the dream of a canal might remain forever out of reach. The United States changed that. By the late 1890s, American leaders realized that a canal was essential for national security. Naval theorists argued that the U.S. must become a two-ocean power. Without a canal, ships traveling between the Atlantic and Pacific coasts had to sail around South America, journey of thousands of miles. A canal would allow the U.S. Navy to move rapidly between oceans. It would unite the country's growing global interests and connect markets across the world. The Spanish-American War confirmed this necessity, when the U.S. battleship Oregon took more than 2 months to reach Cuba from California. The lesson was clear: America needed a shortcut. Panama, however, was not yet an independent nation. It was a province of Colombia. When the United States sought to negotiate a treaty with Colombia for permission to build the canal, Colombian leaders rejected the proposal. Their refusal set the stage for one of the most controversial moves in American foreign policy. In 1903, with quiet encouragement from the United States, Panamanian revolutionaries declared independence from Colombia. American warships positioned off the coast prevented Colombian forces from intervening. Within days, the United States recognized Panama as a sovereign nation. Soon after, Panama granted the U.S. control of the Canal Zone, a 10-mile-wide strip of land through the center of the new country. With the political barrier removed, the United States launched its engineering campaign. Building the Panama Canal was an immense challenge. The region's landscape was harsh and unforgiving. Workers faced landslides, oppressive heat, and the constant threat of disease. The earlier French effort had shown that without effective disease control, the project would be doomed. American doctors, led by William Gorgas, launched a massive public health campaign. They drained swamps, eliminated mosquito breeding grounds, and introduced strict sanitary systems. Within a few years, malaria and yellow fever, once deadly foes, were dramatically reduced. This medical triumph made the canal possible. With disease under control, engineering took center stage. American engineers envisioned a canal unlike any ever built. Instead of digging a sea-level channel, they designed a system of massive locks, giant concrete chambers, capable of lifting ships up into an artificial lake and lowering them back down on the other side. The centerpiece of this system was Gatun Dam, one of the largest dams in the world at the time, which created Gatun Lake. The locks themselves were feats of precision and strength, operated by electricity and capable of moving some of the largest ships of the era. Thousands of workers from the Caribbean, Europe, and the United States labored around the clock, carving through mountains and reshaping the landscape. The most grueling challenge was the Culebra Cut, a long passage through the mountains where engineers struggled against landslides and unstable terrain. Workers blasted through rock with dynamite, removed millions of tons of earth, and battled the forces of nature day after day. Progress was slow and dangerous. Yet with persistence, innovation, and sheer determination, the canal began to take shape. It was a test of human ingenuity, an undertaking so vast that it captured the imagination of the world. By 1914, after a decade of relentless effort, the Panama Canal was finally complete. When the first ship passed through its locks and crossed from the Atlantic to the Pacific, it marked the beginning of a new era in global transportation. The canal shortened trade routes, transformed shipping patterns, and connected distant economies in ways never before possible. What once took months of perilous travel around Cape Horn could now be completed in days. The Panama Canal became an artery of world commerce, carrying goods, resources, and people across oceans. For the United States, the canal was more than an engineering success. It was a strategic triumph. The U.S. Navy could now shift forces between oceans in record time, strengthening America's military posture. The canal also expanded America's influence in Latin America and the Pacific. It gave the United States a central role in global trade and affirmed its status as a rising world power. Presidents hailed the canal as proof that America could accomplish anything it set its mind to. Newspapers celebrated it as a marvel of modern engineering. The canal became a symbol of national pride and technological achievement. Yet the story was not without controversy. Panama had gained independence under circumstances that served American interests more than Panamanian self-determination. The canal zone was governed by the United States, and Panamanians were excluded from much of the land and the benefits it generated. This arrangement created resentment that continued throughout the 20th century. Workers from the Caribbean, who made up a large portion of the labor force, faced discrimination and lower wages. The canal brought progress, but it also exposed inequalities rooted in race, class, and power. Over time, the political debate over the canal deepened. By the mid-20th century, Panamanians increasingly demanded control of their own territory. Protests, negotiations, and political movements ultimately led to the 1977 Torrijos-Carter treaties, which set a timetable for transferring the canal back to Panama. Although the canal would eventually pass out of American hands, its creation remained a defining chapter in the history of U.S. expansion and global influence. The legacy of the Panama Canal is vast. It reshaped maritime trade, altered the geography of power, and demonstrated the United States' ability to undertake massive international projects. It showcased advances in engineering, medicine, and logistics, and it cemented the idea that the United States, now connected from ocean to ocean, was prepared to step onto the world stage as a formidable global force. The canal's waters still carry the echoes of its creation of workers carving through mountains, doctors conquering disease, and a nation determined to connect to oceans. The Panama Canal stands as a monument to human ambition and American influence, a gateway not only between seas but between eras in world history. In the early 20th century, a dramatic shift was unfolding across the Pacific. Japan, once an isolated island nation resisting foreign influence, had transformed into a modern industrial power after the Meiji Restoration. Within a single generation, Japan built factories, strengthened its military, adopted Western technologies, and trained a formidable navy. This rapid modernization astonished the world, but it also introduced a new force into the delicate balance of global power. For the United States now, holding territories like Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines, Japan's rise brought admiration, caution, and growing unease. The first major sign of Japan's new strength came in 1905, when it defeated the Russian Empire in the Russo-Japanese War. It was the first time in modern history that an Asian nation had defeated a major European power. Newspapers across the world took notice. Tokyo celebrated its triumph, while capitals in the West suddenly realized that Japan was not just modernizing, it was emerging as a regional superpower. For American strategists, the victory was both impressive and alarming. Russia's defeat meant Japan now dominated Northeast Asia, especially Korea and parts of Manchuria. That placed Japanese influence much closer to the Philippines, a key American possession. Tensions grew as both nations expanded their presence in the Pacific. The United States believed its role in the region was to maintain stability and protect its new territories. Japan, pursuing its own imperial ambitions, sought resources and strategic footholds. The two nations did not desire war, but their paths were increasingly crossing. Diplomatic agreements attempted to ease tensions. The Rutakahira Agreement in 1908 and the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 limited naval expansion. Yet, beneath the surface, suspicion remained. Both sides watched one another carefully, aware that the Pacific was becoming too small for two expanding powers. In the 1930s, the situation worsened dramatically. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931 and expanded into China in 1937, sparking a conflict that shocked the world. As reports of atrocities and territorial conquest spread, American opinion turned sharply against Japan. The United States condemned Japan's aggression, fearing that unchecked expansion in Asia might eventually threaten American interests in the Philippines and the Pacific Basin. In response, the U.S. increased military presence in the region, modernized its navy, and imposed economic sanctions on Japan, especially restrictions on oil and steel. Each step pushed the two nations further apart. By the end of the decade, the Pacific had become a region of rising tension and mutual distrust. American planners feared that Japan's expanding empire could one day challenge Hawaii, Guam, or the Philippines. Japanese leaders believed the United States was trying to block their nation's growth and limit its access to vital resources. Both sides prepared for a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. Although neither nation openly declared hostility, every move on one side influenced the calculations of the other. Diplomacy continued, but the underlying conflict of interests grew harder to ignore. As 1940 approached, the Pacific stood on the edge of a precipice. Japan's rise had transformed it from a distant island kingdom into a major world power. Its ambitions collided with America's expanding presence and commitments across the Pacific. Two nations, shaped by different histories and visions, now faced one another across the world's largest ocean. The tensions that formed in this era would soon erupt into a global conflict, one that would reshape the Pacific forever. As the world moved closer to global conflict in the late 1930s, Alaska and Hawaii, once distant and often overlooked, American territories suddenly became critical to the nation's security. Their locations, straddling the northern and central Pacific, placed them at the front lines of a rising tension between the United States and Japan. What had once been remote outposts were now emerging as the first points of defense, gateways to the Pacific, and potential targets in a war that seemed increasingly inevitable. Alaska, long viewed as a frozen frontier, began to attract new strategic attention. Military planners recognized that its position near the Soviet Far East and the Northern Pacific made it vital. In any conflict that might spread across the region, airfields were expanded, roads were surveyed, and defense projects quietly accelerated. The rugged terrain that once made Alaska seem impractical now offered unique advantages. It provided early warning opportunities, potential air routes, and a northern shield against hostile forces crossing the Arctic. As tensions grew in Asia, Alaska's isolation no longer felt like a burden, it felt like a barrier America needed to strengthen. Hawaii faced even greater scrutiny. Positioned in the center of the Pacific, over 2,000 miles from the U.S. mainland, the islands formed the heartbeat of American naval power in the region. Pearl Harbor, already a major base, became the hub of the Pacific Fleet. Battleships lined its docks, aircraft patrolled the skies, and thousands of service members arrived to reinforce defenses. Honolulu transformed into a bustling military center, with new fortifications, observation posts, and anti-aircraft installations appearing across the island of Oahu. Yet beneath these preparations, there was an uncomfortable truth. Hawaii's strategic importance also made it one of the most vulnerable places in the Pacific. Japan's growing expansion in East Asia heightened American fears. Reports of Japanese military movements and aggressive actions pushed US leaders to strengthen their Pacific defenses. Intelligence officials warned that Hawaii and Alaska could become targets if conflict erupted. The United States responded by increasing training exercises, reinforcing bases, and repositioning naval forces. Still, uncertainty lingered. No one knew exactly when or how war might begin. Many believed that if Japan struck, it would target the Philippines or British territories. Few predicted the scale, speed, or audacity of the attack that would later unfold. For the people living in Alaska and Hawaii, daily life shifted as the shadows of war grew longer. In Alaska, new roads, military camps, and airfields brought rapid development to once quiet towns. In Hawaii, blackout drills, air raid precautions, and military convoys became part of everyday life. The island's multicultural communities watched anxiously as relations between the United States and Japan deteriorated. Rumors circulated, tensions rose, even as tourists still visited Waikiki and fishermen worked the seas. The sense that something extraordinary was coming hung heavy in the air. By 1940, both Alaska and Hawaii had become symbols of America's readiness and its vulnerability. They stood at the edge of a Pacific world, increasingly shaped by competing empires and expanding militaries. From the icy shores of Alaska to the tropical waters of Oahu, Americans braced for a conflict that had not yet arrived but seemed impossible to avoid. The quiet before the storm was fading, and the Pacific was preparing for a turning point that would change history. By 1940, the United States had transformed from a continental nation focused on its own borders into a true Pacific power. In less than a century, the country had extended its presence from the shores of California to the far reaches of the world's largest ocean. Alaska, Hawaii, Guam, American Samoa, the Philippines, and a chain of Pacific islands formed a network of influence and strategy that reshaped America's identity and role on the global stage. What began as scattered acquisitions and strategic outposts had become a unified structure of power capable of projecting American interests across thousands of miles. The Pacific was no longer a distant frontier. It had become central to American defense, commerce, and diplomacy. With Hawaii serving as the heart of naval operations, Alaska as the northern guard, Guam as a western anchor, and the Philippines as a gateway to Asia, the United States possessed a presence unmatched by any other nation in the region. The ocean that once separated America from the world now connected it. Steamships, telegraph cables, and air routes bound these territories together, creating a vast network of logistical and military pathways. The Pacific had become an American Highway 1, essential for global communication and military readiness. Yet this rise was not simply about geography. It reflected a shift in how the United States saw itself. The nation had once celebrated isolation and independence from old-world politics, but by the early 20th century, America increasingly accepted the responsibilities and burdens of global influence. The Spanish-American War had revealed the power of modern naval strength. The Philippine-American War forced difficult questions about governing distant populations. The construction of the Panama Canal made rapid movement between oceans possible. Each step carried the United States deeper into international affairs, shaping its destiny as a world power. At the same time, the Pacific territories were not just strategic assets. They were home to diverse peoples: native Hawaiians, Chamorros, Samoans, Filipinos, and many others, each with their own cultures, traditions, and identities. American rule brought schools, infrastructure, and political changes. But it also brought tensions, debates, and struggles over sovereignty and self-determination. The United States had become a Pacific empire, but the meaning of that empire differed for those who lived within it. The Pacific was a place of opportunity for America, but also a region where the complexity of empire was felt most deeply. As global tensions increased in the late 1930s, America's Pacific presence took on renewed urgency. Japan's rise as a military power, the intensifying conflict in China, and competing ambitions across the ocean placed the United States and Japan on a collision course. The island chain the United States had built for communication and defense became the front line of a looming conflict. Bases expanded, fleets mobilized, and military planners refined strategies that assumed the Pacific might become the center of the next Great War. By the end of 1940, the United States stood at a moment of transformation. Its Pacific empire was no longer theoretical. It was real, tangible, and essential to national survival. The investments made over decades in territorial expansion, naval bases, and strategic outposts would soon be tested in ways the nation had never imagined. From Alaska's icy frontier to Hawaii's volcanic shores, from Guam's quiet harbors to the Philippines' bustling cities, The Pacific had become a stage on which the future of the world would be decided. The United States entered the 20th century as a rising Pacific power. As it approached the brink of World War II, it stood as one of the region's dominant force, is prepared, uncertain, and facing a challenge that would determine the course of the century. The era of expansion had ended. The era of confrontation was about to begin, from the icy frontier of Alaska to the tropical islands of Hawaii, Guam, American Samoa, the Philippines, and beyond. The United States' expansion across the Pacific reshaped both its identity and its destiny. What began as scattered acquisitions, sometimes through diplomacy, sometimes through war, slowly formed a vast network of territories and strategic outposts that stretched thousands of miles across the world's largest ocean. This transformation did not happen overnight. It emerged from ambition, opportunity, competition, and the belief that America's future extended far beyond the continental mainland. The Pacific story is one of contrast. Bold engineering feats like the Panama Canal and quiet islands holding immense strategic value. It is a story of peoples whose cultures, lands, and lives were forever changed by American arrival. It is a story of a nation discovering its power, testing its ideals, and grappling with the responsibilities of empire. By 1940, the United States stood not as a young republic focused inward, but as a global force with influence stretching from the Arctic to Asia. Yet this rise also carried consequences. It brought conflict, resistance, and debates about liberty and imperialism that still echoed today. It created connections across oceans, but also divisions over sovereignty and identity. The Pacific became both America's pathway to the world and the stage of some of its greatest challenges. As the world moved toward the storms of World War II, the United States stood poised on the edge of a new era, its Pacific empire fully formed, its strategic role undeniable. The decisions made in this period would shape the century to come. The story of America's expansion overseas is not only the story of geography and power, it is the story of how a nation defined its place in the world, and how the Pacific Ocean became a central part of the American journey.